Sometimes a dog doesn't move because it's afraid, but because it knows something you don't. The cabin lights glowed a soft amber as Flight 217 cruised at 32,000 feet, the steady hum of the engines blending into a kind of quiet that felt almost too perfect, the kind of silence Daniel Hayes had learned not to trust, his broad shoulders resting against the worn leather seat as he stared out the small, oval window into a sky that looked endless and cold, while at his feet, where he should have been, Rex was gone. And that was the first thing that felt wrong, because Rex never left his position without a reason, not after everything they had been through together, not after years of training that had wired the dog's instincts tighter than any machine. Daniel's gaze shifted down the aisle slowly, his breath catching just slightly as he spotted the familiar silver-gray coat curled tightly in seat 8A, the dog's body low, tense, not sleeping, not relaxed, but coiled like a quiet signal waiting to be understood. Rex's ears twitched at something no one else could hear, his amber eyes fixed not on the aisle, not on the overhead bins, but on the man seated beside him, an older passenger who looked as ordinary as anyone else on the plane, his hands resting loosely on his lap, his posture slightly hunched, as if the weight of years pressed down heavier than gravity itself. And yet there was something about the way Rex stayed there, close, protective, almost like a guard standing watch, that pulled at something deep in Daniel's memory, something he hadn't felt since the desert nights when silence meant waiting for what came next. The overhead speaker crackled softly, breaking the stillness as the captain's voice came through, calm but edged with something unspoken, asking if anyone on board had experience handling a combat dog. And just like that, every quiet detail snapped into place. Daniel stood slowly, his boots brushing against the narrow aisle as his eyes never left Rex, because he knew that posture. He knew that stillness. It wasn't fear, it wasn't confusion, it was recognition, the kind that came from a place deeper than training, deeper than instinct, the kind that meant something unseen had already begun. As he stepped closer, the air seemed to shift, subtle but undeniable, and the man in 8A lifted his head just enough for the overhead light to catch the thin band around his wrist, worn and faded but unmistakable, a military ID bracelet from a unit Daniel hadn't heard named in over 20 years. His chest tightened, not from panic, but from something older, heavier, as Rex let out a low, almost inaudible breath and pressed closer to the man's leg, not warning him away, but staying, like he had been waiting for this exact moment. And in that quiet space between heartbeats, Daniel realized this wasn't about danger at all. It was about something that had been lost, something that had finally found its way back. Daniel slowed his steps as he reached row 8, the narrow aisle suddenly feeling tighter, as if the air itself had thickened around something unseen. Rex did not look at him right away, which told him everything he needed to know, because when a trained dog avoids eye contact, it is not confusion, it is focus, the kind that shuts out the world to listen for something deeper, something most people never notice. The old man's breathing was uneven now, shallow but controlled, like someone trying not to draw attention to a storm happening quietly inside his chest. Daniel knelt beside the seat, the fabric brushing against his knee as he lowered himself to Rex's level, his hand hovering just above the dog's back without touching, waiting, because trust was not built through commands, it was built through patience. Rex's ears flicked once, then again, a subtle signal, permission. Daniel placed his hand gently against the thick fur, feeling the steady warmth beneath, grounding himself in the moment. The old man turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting Daniel's for the first time, and there was something in them that did not belong to this flight, something distant, like a memory carried too far for too long. "He is a good dog," the man said quietly, his voice thin but steady. Daniel nodded once, his gaze shifting to the bracelet again, the worn metal catching the cabin light just enough to reveal faint engraved numbers and letters, a code Daniel had not seen in 2 decades, not since a place where silence meant listening for signals buried under dust and time. His chest tightened as recognition settled in, not sudden, but slow, like something rising from deep water. "He is more than that," Daniel replied, his voice low, careful. Rex shifted closer to the man, pressing his body lightly against the older man's leg, not in alarm, but in reassurance, a gesture that spoke louder than any warning. The old man's hand trembled slightly before resting against Rex's head, fingers brushing the fur as if remembering something long forgotten. The overhead lights flickered softly as the plane adjusted altitude, a gentle hum changing pitch, and in that subtle shift, Daniel noticed it. The man's breathing faltered, just for a second. Then again, a small gap where rhythm should have been. Rex responded instantly, his body tensing, a soft whine escaping his throat. Not loud, not urgent, but precise, the kind of sound that meant something was about to change. Daniel leaned closer, his voice steady. "Sir, can you hear me?" The man nodded faintly, but his eyes drifted, unfocused, as if caught between here and somewhere far away. Daniel glanced toward the front of the cabin, catching the attention of a flight attendant who had already begun to notice the shift, but he did not call out. Not yet, because panic was not what this moment needed. It needed clarity. It needed calm. Rex let out a slow breath and rested his head firmly against the man's leg, anchoring him, holding him in place in a way no human could. And as Daniel watched the quiet exchange between them, something settled deep inside him, a realization that this was not coincidence, not random, that somehow, across years and distance, something had guided this moment into existence. And whatever was happening here, it had started long before this flight ever left the ground. The rhythm of the cabin seemed to narrow around that single row as if the rest of the plane had quietly stepped back. Daniel stayed low beside the seat, his presence steady, grounded, the way he had learned to be when everything depended on staying calm, while something unseen unfolded. Rex did not move away, his body pressed close to the man, his breathing slow and deliberate, matching a pattern Daniel recognized from years ago, a technique not taught but lived, the kind that kept panic from taking over when the mind began to drift too far. The old man's fingers tightened slightly in the fur at Rex's neck, not gripping, but holding on, like someone reaching for something familiar in the dark. "You hear it too, do you not?" the man whispered, his voice barely above the hum of the engines. Daniel leaned closer, his brow tightening just slightly. "Hear what?" he asked gently. The man's eyes shifted, not focusing on Daniel, but somewhere beyond him, somewhere deeper. "The rhythm," he said, like something calling from far away. Daniel felt a quiet chill settle across his shoulders, not from fear, but from recognition, because he had heard that kind of thing before, not with his ears, but in the way the body reacted before the mind could explain. Rex's ears flicked again, sharper this time, and his head lifted just enough to look directly at Daniel. And in that brief moment, there was no confusion, only certainty. Daniel turned his attention back to the man, watching closely now, noticing the small details that others would miss, the slight delay in his breath, the subtle tremor in his hand, the way his chest rose unevenly, as if following a rhythm that did not belong to the steady pressurized air of the cabin. A flight attendant approached quietly, her steps careful, her expression composed but alert. Daniel gave a small nod, signaling calm rather than urgency, because whatever was happening here required space, not noise. The attendant knelt across the aisle, her voice soft, offering water, but the man did not reach for it, his attention still somewhere distant. Rex shifted again, this time placing one paw gently against the man's leg, a deliberate action, not random. Daniel exhaled slowly, understanding building piece by piece. Rex was not reacting to a threat, he was stabilizing something, grounding it, holding it in place. Daniel spoke again, quieter now. "Sir, stay with me." The man blinked slowly, his eyes returning for a brief moment, and in that flicker of clarity, something passed between them, something unspoken but understood, the kind of recognition that did not need explanation. The overhead speaker crackled once more, but no announcement followed, only a brief burst of static that faded as quickly as it came. And yet Rex's posture changed instantly, his body stiffening just enough to signal that whatever he had been listening to had shifted. Daniel felt it too, not as sound, but as absence, like a note that had suddenly stopped playing. The man inhaled sharply, then steadied, his hand relaxing slightly against Rex's fur. And for the first time since Daniel had reached the seat, the tension eased, just a fraction, but enough to notice. Daniel stayed there, unmoving, his hand still resting lightly against Rex, knowing that whatever this moment was, it had not ended. It had only just begun to reveal itself. The cabin settled into a quieter rhythm, but Daniel knew better than to trust the calm too soon, because moments like this did not resolve. They unfolded, slowly, deliberately, like something waiting for the right second to be understood. Rex remained pressed against the man, his body no longer tense but not relaxed either, holding a careful balance, as if he were listening to something just beneath the surface of everything else. Daniel shifted slightly, his eyes returning to the bracelet, the faded engraving clearer now under the soft overhead light, letters and numbers worn by time but still carrying weight, a unit designation that pulled at a memory he had buried years ago, not because he wanted to forget, but because some things never truly left. They only waited. The old man's breathing steadied for a moment, then changed again, not weaker, but deeper, like someone sinking into a memory instead of the present. His gaze lifted toward the small window across the aisle, though. There was nothing outside but darkness stretched across miles of sky. "It is quieter up here," the man murmured, his voice carrying a strange calm. Daniel followed his gaze, then looked back at him. "Sometimes quiet is where things finally make sense," he replied, though he was not sure if he was speaking to the man or to himself. Rex shifted his weight, placing both paws firmly against the man's leg now. A stronger gesture, deliberate, grounding, the kind of contact that said stay here, stay. Now, the man exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just slightly, as if the weight he carried had eased by an inch. The flight attendant returned, this time with a small oxygen unit in her hands, her movements careful, respectful of the stillness that had formed around them. Daniel gave a small nod, guiding her closer without breaking the fragile calm. The mask was offered gently, and after a brief hesitation, the man accepted, his fingers trembling only slightly as he brought it closer, the soft hiss of oxygen blending into the low hum of the engines, creating a new rhythm, steadier, more certain. Rex responded immediately, his posture easing just a fraction, as if acknowledging the shift. Daniel watched closely, noting every detail. The way the man's chest rose more evenly now, the way his eyes seemed less distant, more anchored, but it was the expression that caught him, not relief, not confusion, but recognition, as if something long out of reach had finally come into view. The man turned his head slowly toward Daniel, studying him with a quiet intensity. "You were there," he said, not as a question, but as a statement shaped by something deeper than memory. Daniel felt the words settle heavily in his chest, not because they surprised him, but because they confirmed what he had begun to feel since he saw that bracelet. "A long time ago," Daniel answered, his voice steady but softer now. The man nodded faintly, his gaze drifting down to Rex, who remained at his side without hesitation. "And he remembers too," the man whispered. Daniel looked at Rex, then back at the man, unsure how to respond, because memory in dogs did not work the same way, or at least that was what he had always believed. But in that moment, with the quiet hum of the plane surrounding them and the strange stillness holding everything in place, it no longer felt impossible. It felt like something else entirely, something that had traveled through time in ways he could not explain. Rex lifted his head slightly, his eyes meeting Daniel's. Again, calm now, certain, as if whatever he had sensed had not disappeared, but changed, and Daniel understood then. This was not about stopping something from happening. It was about being present when it finally did. The soft hiss of oxygen blended into the steady hum of the aircraft, creating a fragile rhythm that seemed to hold everything together. Daniel remained kneeling beside the seat, his posture still, grounded, as if any sudden movement might break whatever quiet understanding had settled between them. Rex stayed close to the man, his body warm and steady, his presence no longer urgent but intentional, like he had found the exact place he was meant to be. The old man's breathing continued to even out, each inhale deeper, each exhale slower, as though something inside him had finally stopped running. His fingers moved gently through Rex's fur, not searching anymore, just remembering. Daniel watched closely, the details unfolding like pieces of something long buried. The bracelet, the way the man spoke, the way Rex had chosen him without hesitation. It was not coincidence, it was connection, the kind that did not announce itself. It revealed itself quietly. The man's eyes shifted back to Daniel, clearer now, steadier. "There was a night," he said slowly, his voice carrying the weight of distance rather than age. "We were waiting, just like this, listening for something we could not see." Daniel felt the memory surface before he could stop it, the cold air, the stillness, the way time stretched between each breath. He nodded once, his jaw tightening slightly. "I remember," he said, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because some memories did not need words, they only needed to be shared. Rex lifted his head slightly, his ears adjusting as if following the tone of their voices. Then he settled again, pressing closer. Anchoring the moment, the man continued, his gaze drifting slightly, not lost, but revisiting. "There was a dog then too," he said. "Not mine, but he stayed close, just like this one." Daniel's eyes moved to Rex, then back to the man, something inside him shifting as the pieces aligned. "Not perfectly, but enough. He kept me awake," the man added softly. "Kept me here." Daniel exhaled slowly, understanding settling deeper. Rex was not just responding to the present, he was responding to something older, something carried forward in ways no one could fully explain. The flight attendant remained nearby, watching quietly, sensing that whatever was happening did not need interruption, only space. The cabin around them continued as normal, passengers unaware, lights dim, the night outside unchanged, and yet within that single row, something had shifted, something quiet but undeniable. The man adjusted the oxygen mask slightly, his hands steadier now, his breathing matching the rhythm of the plane. "I thought I was forgetting," he said, almost to himself. "But maybe it was waiting." Daniel looked at him, then at Rex, who now rested his head gently against the man's leg, eyes half closed but still aware, always aware. And in that moment, Daniel realized something he had not allowed himself to consider before, that not everything lost was gone. Some things circled back in ways that did not follow logic, only timing. The man's hand rested on Rex's head, still, calm, certain, and for the first time since this began, there was no tension left in his posture, only quiet presence, like someone who had finally arrived where they were meant to be, and Daniel stayed there beside them, not as a rescuer, not as a stranger, but as someone who understood that sometimes, the most important thing you could do was simply remain when something found its way back. The plane continued forward through the dark sky as if nothing unusual had happened, yet Daniel could feel the difference in the air, not around the cabin, but within that small space where three lives had quietly intersected, the kind of moment that did not announce itself, but carried a weight that lingered long after it passed. The old man sat a little straighter now, the oxygen flowing gently as his breathing settled into a calm and steady rhythm, his eyes no longer drifting but present, clear, as though something inside him had finally aligned. Rex remained at his side, still and watchful, his body relaxed but his awareness unbroken, like a guardian who had completed one task but had not yet left his post. Daniel shifted slightly, easing back just enough to give the man space while still remaining close, his hand resting lightly on Rex's back, feeling the slow rise and fall beneath his palm. A quiet reassurance that everything was holding together. The old man glanced down at the bracelet again, his fingers brushing over the worn engraving as if tracing a path through memory. "We never finished that mission," he said softly, not with regret, but with a kind of acceptance that only came with time. Daniel listened without interrupting, understanding that some words were not meant to be answered, only heard. The engines hummed steadily above them, a constant presence that now felt less like noise and more like a backdrop to something deeper, something unfolding in its own time. Rex lifted his head slightly, his ears adjusting as if he had caught a shift too subtle for human senses. Then slowly, deliberately, he rested his head against the man's knee once more, a final gesture, not urgent, not questioning, but complete. The man exhaled, longer this time, his shoulders lowering as a quiet calm settled over him. "I thought I left all of that behind," he murmured. Daniel looked at him, then at Rex, then out toward the dim cabin stretching beyond them. "Sometimes it finds a way back when it needs to," he replied, his voice low, steady. The man nodded faintly, as if that answer was enough, as if it filled a space he had carried for longer than he realized. The flight attendant approached once more, her expression softer now, Reassured by the change she could not fully explain, Daniel gave her a small nod, signaling that everything was under control, though. Even he knew this was not something that could be measured or explained in simple terms. It was something felt, something understood without needing to be named. Rex finally shifted his position, slowly rising from the seat, his movements calm and unhurried. He stepped down into the aisle and returned to Daniel's side, not because he was called, but because whatever had drawn him there had completed its purpose. Daniel's hand moved to rest on the dog's head, fingers brushing gently between his ears, a silent acknowledgement, not of obedience, but of trust. The old man watched them for a moment, a faint smile forming, not wide, not dramatic, but real, the kind that came from something deep settling into place. And as the plane continued its path through the night, steady and unseen against the vast sky, Daniel understood something he had not fully grasped before, that some connections did not belong to a single moment or place. They moved quietly through time, waiting for the exact point when they could be seen again, and sometimes it took a dog to find that moment first. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane crossed into a quieter stretch of sky, the kind of stillness that felt almost sacred, like the world outside had softened just enough to let something unseen settle into place. Daniel returned slowly to his seat, but did not fully sit. His body angled toward row 8 as if part of him remained there. Anchored to the moment that had not yet fully released him, Rex stood beside him, calm now, his posture loose but attentive, his ears still catching the subtle rhythms that moved beneath the surface of the ordinary. The old man rested back into his seat, the oxygen mask now lowered to his lap, his breathing steady without assistance, his chest rising and falling in a natural cadence that seemed to echo the hum of the engines above. For a while, nothing was said, and yet the silence did not feel empty. It felt full, like a conversation that no longer needed words. The man finally turned his head again, his eyes finding Daniel across the narrow distance. "I used to think memories faded," he said quietly, like they had an expiration date. Daniel listened, his hands resting lightly on Rex's back, feeling the warmth and weight of something real, something present. "But some of them just wait," the man continued. "Wait until you are ready to meet them again." Daniel exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting briefly toward the window where nothing but darkness stretched across the sky, then back to the man. "Or until something brings them back," he replied, his voice low but certain. The man's eyes softened, a faint understanding passing through them like a reflection of something long carried. "Not something," he said gently, glancing down at Rex. "Someone." Rex lifted his head at the sound of the man's voice, his tail giving a slow, single movement against the floor, not excitement, not distraction, but acknowledgement, as if he understood the weight of being seen in that way. The flight attendant passed quietly once more, offering a small cup of water. This time the man accepted, his hand steady as he took a sip, the simple act carrying more meaning than it should, like proof that the moment had shifted from uncertainty into something grounded. Daniel finally eased into his seat, though his attention never fully left the row ahead. Rex settled beside him again, lowering himself to the floor with a soft exhale, his body relaxed but his presence still alert, always alert. The plane continued forward, miles passing beneath them unseen, time moving in its quiet, steady way, and yet for Daniel, it felt like something had paused, just long enough for him to notice what had always been there. The man leaned his head back slightly, closing his eyes, not in exhaustion, but in peace, the kind that comes when something unfinished finds its way to rest. Daniel watched him for a moment, then looked down at Rex, his hand resting gently on the dog's neck. "You knew," he whispered, not expecting an answer. Rex did not move, but there was something in the stillness, something that felt like confirmation, not spoken, not proven, but understood. And as the engines carried them steadily through the night, Daniel realized that whatever had brought them together in that single row had not been chance. It had been timing, the kind that does not ask for attention, only recognition. And in that quiet realization, something inside him, something he had carried without naming for years, finally felt a little lighter. The gentle descent began almost unnoticed, a slight shift in the engine's tone, a subtle angle in the cabin that only those who paid attention could feel. Daniel sensed it before the announcement came. The way he had learned to read movements that others ignored. Rex's ears lifted just a fraction, catching the same change, his body adjusting instinctively, as if aligning with something beyond the physical motion of the plane. The old man opened his eyes slowly, not startled, not confused, but aware, as though he had been expecting this moment all along. The overhead lights brightened slightly, casting a warmer glow across the rows, and for the first time, the world outside the window showed a faint trace of light along the horizon, a distant line where night began to loosen its hold. The captain's voice followed, calm and steady, announcing their initial descent, but it felt secondary to what had already shifted within that quiet space. The man reached down, his fingers brushing once more over the worn bracelet, then resting there as if closing a chapter he had carried for too long. Daniel watched without speaking, understanding that this moment belonged to the man, not to him. Rex rose slowly from his position, stepping forward with quiet purpose, not returning fully to Daniel yet, but pausing once more beside the seat, his head lifting just enough to meet the man's gaze. And in that brief exchange, something passed between them, something that did not need language. The man's lips curved into a faint, steady smile, not the kind that comes from relief, but the kind that comes from recognition finally complete. His hand moved from the bracelet to Rex's head, resting there gently, his fingers still, grounded, present. "Thank you," he said softly, the words carrying more than gratitude, carrying closure. Rex remained still beneath his touch, accepting it without movement, as if he understood the weight behind it. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest, not pain, but something close, something that reminded him of all the moments that had passed without resolution, and how rare it was for one to come full circle like this. The plane continued its descent, the faint glow outside growing stronger, soft light spreading across the clouds below, like something waking up. The man lowered his hand slowly, his posture relaxed in a way it had not been before, his breathing steady without effort. His gaze forward now, not searching, not distant, simply present. Rex turned then, finally stepping back into the aisle and making his way to Daniel's side, his movement calm, unhurried, as though his work had reached its natural end. Daniel rested his hand on Rex's neck again, fingers pressing lightly into the fur, a silent acknowledgement of something he could not fully explain but no longer questioned. The cabin around them began to stir as passengers shifted, adjusting seats, preparing for landing, unaware of what had unfolded just a few rows away. And yet for Daniel, the space felt different now, not because anything visible had changed, but because something invisible had settled, something that had been waiting had finally found its moment. The man glanced back once more, his eyes meeting Daniel's briefly, a quiet understanding passing between them, not of shared details, but of shared presence. And as the plane moved steadily toward the ground, carried by forces unseen yet precise, Daniel realized that not every mission ended with action. Some ended with stillness, with recognition, with the quiet certainty that something had been returned exactly where it belonged. The wheels touched the runway with a soft, steady thrum, a gentle return to earth that felt almost quieter than the sky they had just left behind. The cabin shifted as the plane slowed, a collective exhale moving through the passengers as they gathered their belongings and prepared to step back into their lives. But for Daniel, the moment lingered, stretched just a little longer than it should have. As if something unseen was not quite ready to let go, Rex remained at his side, calm and still. His work finished, yet his presence unchanged. The old man stayed seated for a moment after the plane came to a full stop, his hands resting loosely on his lap, his breathing steady, his posture no longer burdened by something Daniel could not see but had clearly felt. The seatbelt sign chimed softly overhead, a small, ordinary sound that marked the end of the flight, yet it carried a quiet finality, like the closing note of something that had resolved exactly as it was meant to. Daniel stood slowly, allowing the aisle to clear, his eyes drifting once more toward row 8. The man looked up at him, a calm, grounded expression in his eyes. No urgency, no confusion, just presence. "You stayed," the man said softly, not as a question, but as an acknowledgement. Daniel gave a small nod, his voice low. "So did you." The man's lips curved into a faint smile. one that held no strain, no effort, just something real and settled. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a small folded piece of paper, worn at the edges. He hesitated for just a second, then extended it toward Daniel. "I carried this for a long time," he said. Daniel took it carefully, unfolding it just enough to see a faded photograph, two figures standing side by side in a place defined more by memory than by detail, and between them, a dog, alert, steady, present. Daniel's breath caught slightly, not from surprise, but from recognition, not of the faces, but of the feeling, the same quiet certainty that had filled the space moments before. He looked up, but the man only nodded gently, as if no explanation was needed. Rex stepped forward once more, just enough to brush his shoulder lightly against the man's leg, a final, almost invisible gesture. The man placed his hand briefly on Rex's head, then withdrew it, not holding on, not lingering, just acknowledging what had already been completed. Passengers began moving past them, the rhythm of the world returning, voices, footsteps, the ordinary sounds of arrival. Daniel folded the photograph carefully and placed it in his pocket, not as something borrowed, but as something entrusted. The man rose slowly, steady on his feet, no longer fragile, no longer searching, just present. As he stepped into the aisle, he paused for a moment beside Daniel, his voice quiet but certain. "Some things do not get lost," he said. "They just wait for the right moment to be found again." Daniel watched him move forward with the others, blending into the flow of people, becoming just another passenger in a crowded space. And yet something about him remained, something that did not fade with distance. Rex returned fully to Daniel's side, his body relaxed, his eyes calm, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. Daniel rested his hand on the dog's neck, his fingers pressing gently into the fur, grounding himself in what was real, what was here. And as they stepped off the plane and into the quiet light of early morning, Daniel realized that not every story ends with a clear answer. Some end with a feeling, a quiet understanding that settles into place without needing to be explained. And sometimes that is enough, because not all missions are meant to be remembered in detail. Some are meant to be felt, carried forward in silence, like a rhythm that only a few can hear. And once you do, you never forget it.